welcome back to 237, back with another review. And now we've done it. This is kind of wrapping up my series of reviews for the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. I have already done Freddy vs. Jason way back when I did the Friday the 13th films. My opinion is still the same, so I'm not going to do another video, but I will add that review to this playlist. But we do come to the final film in the original series, and yes, I will do the remake as well, 'cause I thought I already did it. But 1994's Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Now, while this is considered the 7th installment and the final film in the original series, it's not set in the same continuity. It's not canon in any way, mainly because it takes the meta concept that Wes Craven would eventually go on to use in Scream and set this in the real world, revolving around cast and crew of the original Nightmare on Elm Street film. So it came out in 94, 3 years after the release of the awful Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. And apparently, head of New Line, Bob Shea, decided there was still something else he wanted to do with Freddy. Probably bleed the cow a little bit more. So he reached out to Wes Craven, who hadn't really been offered anything since he pitched an idea for part 3. And Bob Shea really wanted Craven to do this film that he even set aside. He fixed all the fallout from their financial differences from the original film, all the creative differences they had, and pretty much let Craven tell the story he wanted to tell. So Bob Shea really kind of stepped up, fixed all the problems with Craven, and let him do his kind of definitive sequel, even though it's not really a sequel. It can work as one, really. Freddy being fictional and then finding a way into the real world with, where Nancy is actually a Heather Langenkamp and Freddy's actually Robert Englund, which Freddy is actually credited as himself in this, which I thought was cool. So written and directed by Wes Craven, obviously, and one thing a lot of people do like about this film is, and also why Craven wanted to do this, is because he was super unsatisfied with the direction the franchise went in after a certain point, feeling he was too silly, too cartoonish, unscary. So he really went back and gave us one of the more evil and sinister Freddys, at least since the original. I mean, 2, he seems pretty evil as well, but he is just downright menacing in this one. With the whole new look, this film is also known for a very different look for Freddy. He looks more so skinned rather than burnt. His glove isn't really super mechanical like this, even though that does appear in the film. It's more of like this organic or biomechanical look. He has a trench coat, which, if you've ever heard the story, the inspiration for Freddy and his look by Wes Craven, it's actually a very creepy story, and I think that's why he added the trench coat in this. You can hear the story on the Never Sleep Again documentary, which I do highly recommend. And it brings Heather Langenkamp back into star. Robert Englund, both as himself and Freddy. Miko Hughes plays Heather's son, Dylan. Everyone knows him as Gage from Pet Sematary. John Saxon, her father from the original film and the third film. And I say this every time. May he rest in peace. He passed away, I believe, last year. Either 2020 or 2021. Fantastic character actor. Whether it's an American horror film or an Italian giallo, I always love seeing John Saxon. But you also have appearances by Wes Craven, producer Sarah Risher, head of CEO of New Line, Bob Shea. And they do fare for what they're supposed to, because they're not actors, but Wes Craven did all right with his acting. Bob Shaye, as far as all the people that are behind the scenes and not really actors, I'd probably say Bob Shaye was probably more convincing, but then again, he's a producer. He's part of his job is to sell things to people. He's really got to pitch stuff, so maybe he was able to use that to his disposal. But I really liked the idea, and of course, this would be further explored in Scream 2 years later. It being set around set in the real world, which actually filmed in '94 in L.A. Originally, it was called Nightmare on Elm Street 7: The Ascension, and they had already written in earthquake scenes, but there was in real life at that time a series of earthquakes, so they got a lot of footage of the earthquake devastation for the film. And also, there's a lot of great homage and tribute stuff in this, as far as lines or recreations of certain events or kills from the original film. Thus, I think that makes it more respectful towards the original than this film, which again I'll get to. This feels more like a ripoff, where this feels like a respectful tribute, homage, because this was also made to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the original film. But I like the idea that it's a Heather Langenkamp. She's married to this guy Chase, who's a special effects guy, which I wonder if she really was married at that time. David Leroy Anderson, married in '89. He is a special effects guy. Okay. And they own their own company together. That's cool. Oh, he had a son with Langenkamp who passed away from cancer in 2018. So that's sad. So he must have been... Her son must have actually been 7 at the time this came out. But, yeah, her husband's name in this is, Chase. Something... Chase Porter. Okay, yeah. And I guess the role was originally offered to him, but he declined because he thought it'd be too close. And actually, Wes Craven was too shy to ask Johnny Depp to come back to make an appearance. But after it was released, they saw each other, and Depp said that he would have been happy to do it. Which is kind of surprising, because he's never been in documentaries about Elm Street. He was in Freddy's Dead as a cameo. He doesn't really talk about Elm Street. But it would have been cool to see him from his first film to essentially a superstar at that point. Also, there's Tracy Middendorf as the nanny of her son. And Fran Bennett, that's her name, as Dr. Hefner, who... The name Hefner comes from, I think it's the head of the MPA. Yes. Former MPA ratings chief Richard Hefner. And the representation of her character and why it's named Hefner, I thought was very interesting. This definitely has that Craven wit, that Craven social commentary he's always been so good at. I think that's been one of his best talents as far as storytelling. But, so, Heather Langenkamp, playing herself, has a special effects husband, 7-year-old son. She's been getting these weird calls from seemingly a Freddy fan or a Freddy impersonator. Dylan starts seeing the first Elm Street on TV, having nightmares. And then all of a sudden, she starts having nightmares about like her husband being killed in some accident involving making a new Freddy glove. And then there's talks with Bob Shea and New Line and Robert Englund and Wes Craven about this new Nightmare film, wanting to bring Nightmare back. But it seems that Freddy is going beyond the script that's being written and crossing over into the real world. I really like that idea. At this time, that was very different. You didn't really have... I mean, you had movies about a film crew making a movie. Maybe even making a movie titled what the movie is. But you didn't really have anything this meta before. So even though it received positive reviews, I think people were kind of taken aback by it, didn't really know what to make of it. So then when Scream came out, which is even more meta, and probably because it's more humorous, where this is very dark, I think people were able to kind of get the concept of meta at that time. But, so yeah, by the time Scream came out, people were definitely ready. But, so this was ahead of its time. And it does a lot with sort of like where Scream is about horror fans, this is about people that make horror. Like it shows how people always think of Heather as Nancy. There's a great scene where she goes to a talk show where the host is saying, "Oh, you have a son? Do you let him watch your movies? Would you let Robert Englund babysit your kid?" And I love the scene when Robert Englund comes out the talk show as a surprise, and he's just waving to the fans, which is pretty autobiographical, because anytime Robert Englund donned the makeup, which he would for any small event, anytime, he always gave it 100% and always had a blast. I mean, I know it's a movie, but he was like this. High-fiving all the fans and kind of doing this wave. And I love the shot when he's back too, and just that spotlight is on him. And he's like slow motion, just kind of waving. And we even hear this echoey, like, "You're all my children now." There's great nods like that. When she has these nightmares about Freddy. So like when she calls Robert Englund to say, "I'm having these nightmares about Freddy," and he's like, "What, me?" She's like, "No, he's different. And then Robert Englund cuts her off. He's like, "He's darker, more evil," as if to say, yeah, Freddy's back. He is darker. It's really given a commentary on what they're trying to accomplish with this film. And I thought it was very smart. It's very well written. Definitely, it might not have the same entertainment or rewatch value that, say, Dream Warriors has, but it's definitely the best written and most clever since the original. And yeah, there's some deaths that come up, like Nancy's husband falls asleep at the wheel. We do get a shot of his lap where the glove comes up between his legs, very reminiscent of the bathtub scene. Stabs him, he dies. And Miko Hughes is having nightmares as well. He's afraid of the man with the claws. He even puts his stuffed dinosaur Rex at the foot of his bed to guard him, which Wes Craven kept that dinosaur. And he says it's always a tender reminder of, kind of childlike innocence and what we look at to take care of us as kids. And the phone calls keep getting worse. Her dreams keep getting worse. Conversations she starts having starts to be very reminiscent of Nightmare on Elm Street. Like, her relationship with John Saxon is very similar to, he's this very supportive older father figure to Heather, much like he was her father in the Elm Street films. And it does do that thing where, like, we find out that the script that Craven is writing is everything that's happened thus far. And so when it actually shows the script and it shows his computer, it's like the conversation that just happened, which is a trope that we've seen time and time again. I do like the idea that, you know, not quite sure what it's trying to say exactly, but you know how Craven always, like, he'll find an inspiration in like history books or fairy tales and he'll do his own version of it. Well, here he says there's this ancient entity that feeds off the death of the innocent that the Elm Street film series sort of resurrected and has sort of come alive but still not in our realm and taken the form of Freddy. I guess because that's the form it likes, but also because that's the catalyst of what brought him back. And the way for him to come into the real world is to kill Nancy. Or kill Nancy. And I really like the conversation between Wes and Heather when he's explaining this to her and he tells her, you know, because she's saying, well, how do we stop it? How can we stop him? And he says, well, it's Nancy. And this is a very meta conversation because the way they talk about Nancy is really about the original film. You know, because he's saying you have to stop him, but she's like, well, he says, you know, it makes sense because you were in the original film. You were the one that originally stopped him. And she says, that wasn't me. That was Nancy. He says, yeah, but you were the one that gave Nancy life. You were the one that, you know, put spirit into Nancy. And so, like, it has to be you. It has to be Nancy to stop him for good. Which pretty much saying, if you're going to come back and do a definitive nightmare movie, even if it's outside of continuity, you got to go back to basics, go back to its roots. And yeah, bring Heather back, bring Nancy back. That's who we want to see. That's who it has to be. If we're going to do a film about killing Freddy for good, it has to be Nancy. So, the whole meta approach was very well done. Now, the doctor, because eventually Dylan's health gets really bad, she has to take him to the hospital, and he refuses to sleep. This doctor there, played by Fran Bennett, Dr. Christine Hefner, who I guess she's a very well-respected theater actress. She might think there's some child abuse going on, or that she let Dylan watch the Elm Street films and scarred him. And Fran Bennett, the actress, has this very raw, biting intensity that reminds me of other actresses like a CCH Pounder, who was in Psycho 4. She was Sister Abigail in Orphan. I'd probably say Fran Bennett is actually the best actress in this whole movie. I mean, for her smaller role, she's very intense, and I really liked her performance. She's named Hefner after that ratings chief for the MPA because she talks about, you know, the trauma and damage that horror and violence can do to kids and kids' minds. That's sort of what she's supposed to represent. So I like that idea. And of course, you can't have the kid from Pet Sematary not be creepy. I mean, throughout most of the film, he's kind of the horror movie creepy kid. Like, he sleepwalks, kind of like he's possessed. And I mean, there's parts where he wakes up and he has this croaky, like, never sleep again. Or a nightmare that Heather has when he's taped knives to his fingers and he goes to slash her. So he does get to do some creepy Gage type moments that you would expect. But other than that, he still is a decent child actor. I do believe he's scared when he's supposed to be scared. In fact, if you watch Never Sleep Again, during the climax when they're in Freddy's lair, I guess Wes asked either his parents or his coach or whatever. he's like, I need him to be really scared. I need him to be as scared as possible. Is there any kind of trick or anything that you do, like an acting trick to get him that scared? They're like, well, there is this one trick, but we don't like to do it too often. It's like, do it. Just do it. They did the scene, went well. The kid was terrified. I think it was when he had to go into Freddy's mouth, or at least when he was in the furnace. And the kid was terrified. And so then Wes went up to them and was like, that was great. What'd you, how'd you get him to do that? And they say, oh, we tell him that his mom died. And even Wes was like, Jesus, I didn't want you to tell him that. Then it was kind of funny because he said he was rewarded with a Happy Meal, and I guess he was fine. So I guess that's how they used to get Miko Hughes terrified. But also the scene when he was up on the giant jungle gym. I guess that was a rundown playground, and they let him take the jungle gym home. But yeah, I really believed him. The Hefner, Fran Bennett was great. The scenes in the hospital is really towards the end. So, and Robert Englund completely disappears after their phone call where he's like, Freddy's more evil, more darker. Almost as if to say Freddy's coming into the real world. Maybe even through Robert Englund. But even that doesn't really make sense because Freddy never enters the real world in this one. They do go in and stop him in the dream world. You do get the crazy scene where Dylan's sleepwalking after the babysitter is killed, which is reminiscent of Tina's death, where she's dragged up the wall and ceiling. Only this time it cuts back and forth to seeing her just sliding up the wall and seeing Dylan's dream where Freddy's standing on the wall and the ceiling dragging her. He does look cool with his trench coat. His one-liners are definitely darker and more sinister than they have been probably ever. But you get the scene where Dylan goes to walk through the freeway and cars are going everywhere, which, I mean, it could have been coincidence because it's a freeway. Because there was a scene with like a gas truck where Heather has to duck and it goes over her. But seeing a young Miko Hughes go across the freeway with all these big trucks coming at him, very reminiscent of Pet Sematary. But then the ending turns into Hansel and Gretel, which I think was on purpose because there's a scene where Heather's reading it to him. She doesn't want to finish it, and then he just recites the ending. I think that was supposed to be a creepy moment. But she finds all Dylan's sleeping pills, like the breadcrumbs, which at this point she turns into Nancy. John Saxon is there. They recreate the lines like Fred Krueger did it. Yeah, right. But when they go outside the house, he's in his Dawn Thompson costume. She's in her pajamas from the first film. They enact that last scene they did together. She goes back in the house, follows the sleeping pills, and then goes into Freddy's lair. And Freddy's lair is pretty cool in this. Definitely has the budget behind it. Which, I think this is the first Nightmare film they made after they became, like, a major, like, multi-million-dollar company. I'm not quite, well, because I think 5 and 6 was when they started using that title card instead of, like, the flashing red in the older films. But you could definitely see the budget with this one. And so much so that it's really the only super fantastic dream scene we get. This is more of a slow burn character study. So we get a glimpse of Freddy a half hour in, which is during her husband's funeral, where there's an earthquake, casket falls and opens. We see Freddy kind of dragging Dylan down the casket into the ground. It's like this endless like velvet or whatever fabric the casket is. And then at like in hour 8 minutes, Freddy comes out full body to attack Heather in a dream. And those are really the only scenes we get of Freddy up until the hospital, where you get that cool scene where he's up in the clouds and he's lifted Dylan by his pajama shirt over the trucks. So you don't get a lot of Freddy or a lot of dream scenes. So when you actually get to the climax and you get to his lair, it is almost like a totally different film. But I do like how it's very rooted in reality, so that this dream sequence seems very surreal. And it is very hellish, gothic, don't really know how to describe it. It is kind of, well, because Nancy goes under Dylan's blanket, and it's like this endless bed. Then she goes through this thing where the wall looks like Freddy's face, and there's like a waterfall out his mouth. Looks like a hellscape. But then down at the bottom, there's like Roman pillars, and very stone dungeon looking little like barred windows that go into like these places with flames or whatever. It's kind of like a hell dungeon. Freddy comes out, attacks them for a bit. Then they recreate Hansel and Gretel, where Dylan hides in this furnace where there's flames here, but he can stand around the edge. And I don't know if this is a nod to Freddy's first appearance in the first film, where his arms are really long, but he's trying to reach Dylan and his arm stretches. Maybe it was just because, but it made me think of that Tina's dream sequence. He grabs him, he does that thing where his mouth stretches, and he tries to eat him. Some of the effects are kind of wonky, like when he's trying to shove Dylan into his mouth, or when his tongue gets really long, the animatronic his tongue comes out of. Kind of wonky. The CGI doesn't look that bad for 1994. Definitely looks better than in Freddy's Dead. Better than some other films of the 90s, like Mortal Kombat Annihilation. But Nancy comes up, stabs him, then his tongue comes out, wraps around her head, and you see Robert Englund like standing at the bars, making all these faces as they fuck with his tongue. Which, that's not the first time. They do recreate the phone with the tongue coming out. I thought that was a nice nod. But they're able to close the furnace, push him in it. He burns. Which, I mean, it's not the best CGI, but for 94, engulfed in flames, his head turns into like a demon head. Then he explodes. They dive back into like the pool that she fell in, and they burst out of his bed. Then she finds the script for the film. She starts reading it to Dylan. End of movie. So maybe it's not the biggest way they've killed Freddy. I mean, it's basically just a Hansel and Gretel ending. They throw him in the furnace, and then he burns. Which is kind of weird, since it's in the dream world. You think he'd be okay with flames, but there's not really anything about taking back his power or not being afraid of him anymore, or anything reminiscent of the first film, which I was surprised by. But it's still fine. I mean, the rest of the movie is good, even if it's kind of a lackluster way of how he dies. At least he looked cool. His lair looked cool. I am glad they didn't continue with this look for Freddy. I do think it works better self-contained to this film. I definitely think it works as like a character study. A sort of... I don't know why I keep stuttering with that word. Meta social commentary on horror filmmakers and just kind of what their lives are like, or surrounding their life as horror icons. And, how Wes is having all these nightmares and he just jots them down. He makes movies based on his nightmares in this context. And all the nods to the original film I thought worked. They didn't feel out of place. They definitely felt respectful and respected, which again is far off from this film. Of the original series, the first 7 films, I would definitely have to put this again, as far as entertainment goes, I would probably put the first three over this. Or maybe it's tied with two. But I would definitely say these two are my two favorite Elm Street films. 1 and 3. And then these two might be tied for third place. This one might just be more entertaining, and I like how dark it is. But this is definitely better written, made, performed, everything. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and say these are the best four. 1, 3, New Nightmare, and 2. And then these are the ones I genuinely... 4 is okay. I don't care for it. But it's better than these two. 5 is weak as hell. Not bad enough to hate, but not good enough to watch again or care about. And this one's absolutely terrible. Do not like this film at all. Worst sequel of the bunch. But yeah, I could definitely see why Scream was probably a big hit, because this is the perfect precursor to Scream. And you can definitely tell that maybe Wes Craven was kind of either restricted or constricted by the confines of the series of Elm Street or Freddy to stay within the limits or context of that story and characters, that when he came to Scream, he could really let his imagination go and make something totally original. Not to say this film isn't original, but yeah, I've always enjoyed this film. It's not one I watch a lot, but whenever I do watch it, it's definitely different. Again, it's slower paced, more of a character study. Not so much a slasher film. It definitely doesn't take the slasher approach. But it is kind of a real look at, what if a horror icon was able to manifest itself and go after the people that created him. But yeah, I've always liked it. Definitely among the better half of the original series. But that's it. That is all 7 original Nightmare on Elm Street films. At some point, I'll go over the 4-hour documentary of Never Sleep Again. I've already done Freddy vs. Jason, but I'll add it to this playlist. So the only one I have left is the remake. So stay tuned for that. And I hope you enjoyed this series of the original Nightmare on Elm Street films. And thank you for watching.